The day I lost my third child, I thought I was going to lose my mind. The pain was unbearable. I can't even take myself back to that day. I felt broken. And honestly, after losing my third child, not all at the same time, 1, 2, 3, I was done playing submissive with God. It's God's plan. This is, you can do this. God wouldn't give you more than you could handle. I was done with all of that. Come with me and listen to my journey of mental strength, of how did I actually, or how am I continuing to work through such unimaginable pain? My name's Christy Bundukumara. I'm a psychiatric nurse practitioner with over 20 plus years of clinical psychiatric and psychology experience. But I am an expert in traumatic grief because I know grief and I know trauma, and I have learned how to actually live in that pain, process that pain, find joy, find understanding. If you've seen my documentary, I began filming my documentary 11 months after my third child passed, Maya. Her name is Maya. I also lost a son, Reggie, 6 years prior to that, and my son, Johnny, 17 years prior to that. And when I began this journey that I filmed the whole thing and created a grief documentary, it was 11 months after my third child passed, and I had not even began grieving. So if you are in that first year after traumatic grief, give yourself grace. You're still in shock. You're still in trying to figure out a way to function. I want to share with you the top 3 things that I have learned in my journey that has truly helped me. I want you to throw out that grief theory that says grief is 5 stages and you just will naturally move through that. Traumatic grief is not like that. And if you are watching this because you want to help a friend who's going through traumatic grief, I challenge you to just sit with them. Sit with them in their pain. Be understanding and gracious. Yes, the things that I will share come from deep knowledge and intimate processing myself. But they can't just be taught as a 1, 2, 3, do these things and you won't feel the pain. The pain of grief is our badge of honor. You hear, even in normal grief, you lose your 95-year-old grandmother. That is considered normal grief. We all will pass along. But you still, on Christmas, when you think about her making you cakes and cookies, you might still get sad. You might still celebrate her birthday. That is grief. It's cherishing the memory. But when relationships are cut short, when you lose your child, even if it was an adult child, that is trauma. That is not normal grief. And there's no grief theory that will explain the pain that you are going through, that your friend is going through. There are 3 things that I learned that I teach in my courses. I teach the Mentally Strong Method, which I created after Reggie passed away. And then the Grief Intensive, which I started doing 3 years after Maya passed away. And what I teach in the Grief Intensive, this first major thing is we must separate the grief and trauma. So if you're, speaking with a counselor, or if you are a counselor, you have psychology background, you know that, you're taught that these 5 stages of grief is grief, and then you know that trauma can be held in the body and create chaos in the body, and that the therapeutic goal of trauma is to release that trauma, process and release. And there are many ways that you can do that. But what happens when it's enmeshed with your grief? You cannot convince me to let go of the pain of my child's death, of losing my child, with Reggie, I had 10 years of medical trauma and the fear of losing him, but there was so much life and energy in that boy. That is all enmeshed together. That grief and trauma is enmeshed together. And the first thing we need to do is separate that grief and trauma, because the therapeutic goal of trauma is to process and release, because trauma will cause havoc on the body. I have several videos on the physical manifestations of this trauma in the body. But grief, we are to cherish. We are to cherish the loss of this loved one. And so the first thing I learned is to separate that grief and trauma. It wasn't until losing my third child that I realized how much trauma. I knew since Reggie's death, and I had been teaching kind of controlled grief and feeling that pain of grief, and the intensity and frequency in which you have to feel it will decrease. But it wasn't until losing my third child that I realized how much trauma was associated with these deaths and how much I was still holding on to. So the first thing I learned, and I teach this in my grief intensive, is to separate your grief from your trauma. And then the second thing I learned, remember I said it wasn't until after the third child that I realized how much trauma, is that you really must consciously work through your trauma. It's not enough to just say, I have trauma, because trauma has such a negative impact on our bodies, our mind, our emotional state, our physical state, and our spiritual state. And so number two, so first is separating that grief and trauma. Number two is what works for you to release that trauma. And there's professional ways. You can see a professional counselor, EMDR, brain spotting. You could do somatic yoga. There's, types of meditation that release somatic symptoms. Somatic is physical manifestation of this trauma. There's energy work. There's different things that you can do for your trauma. But number two is you've got to learn how to process and release that trauma. And if we've separated it from the grief, you're able to do that, right? Because if it's enmeshed with that grief, you're like, this is the pain of my trauma. This is the pain of my grief. I'm not letting this go. But I can tell you the pain of your grief, when you can separate it from the trauma, it feels different. It's pain, but it feels different. And number three is the spiritual conflict. People often ask me after they've seen my documentary, out of all the things that you did, what was the one thing that stood out the most? And it wasn't one thing, because I did it over a couple things over the course of the 45 days. But I explored an authentic spiritual relationship. And I am not here to proselytize, to say that there is a way that you must process this pain, this conflict. But I can tell you, in traumatic grief, for myself and everyone that I try to help, there is a spiritual conflict. Whether you are like me and you had a strong, faith system that you believed in wholeheartedly and that was shattered to its core, or you don't believe in God at all. It doesn't matter. where you are on that spectrum. What matters is that you have experienced an unimaginable loss that cannot be explained by a universal energy or a God that loves you. In this grief documentary, I explored several things, and I even said some of the things that I explored, my Christian friends would caution and say that might be evil. But I gave myself permission. Remember what I said in the beginning? After losing my third child, I was done being submissive to this belief system. And your spiritual relationship is very special and intimate and unique to you. But I encourage you to wrestle with that and determine how that's impacting you and how you can heal your spiritual self. So those three things are separating the grief and trauma, actively processing and releasing your trauma, and then identifying, acknowledging, addressing your spiritual conflict and working through that, healing through that. I would love to hear your stories. Share in the comments a little bit about maybe who you've lost, what things are working for you. I want to create a community of positive thinkers, that we can do this. We can do this. I invite you to start your journey. I have a grief intensive that I run every 3 months. You come here to Colorado Springs and we spend the first day wrestling with the grief, trying to rip it apart from the trauma. Day 2, we work on that trauma. And day 3, we work on that spiritual conflict. Going into some questions. These are questions that I got from people prior to attending the grief intensive. They had a call with me and they asked these questions. And the first one, she had lost her daughter 3 years prior. She had done lots of personal growth and work on herself. She had been, trying to work through her sadness and her anger. But she's like, I have this deep anger that I can't get rid of. I try to talk myself out of it all the time, and I just can't get rid of it. Now, I got to spend 3 days with her to help her work through this question. But at the end of day 2, she had went back to her hotel and come in the next day sharing a story of how she had a moment with her daughter that was no anger. It was just the grief. And yes, she was crying and she felt her daughter's presence. But it wasn't anger. And how did we do that? We really worked through separating that grief and trauma and, trying to work through that trauma to release that, because anger is a secondary emotion. And people find this hard to believe. There is always something under anger. So for her, it was the hurt of the trauma, the spiritual conflict, the holding on to the trauma was manifesting as anger. Second person, her question was, it's only been 8 months since my 3-year-old son passed away. And she's like, I don't even know where I am in this process. And so I want to come to the grief intensive and figure out where I am. And I'll tell you what she learned. She learned that just like me, right at that 9 months, I realized I had not even began grieving my daughter, Maya. And that was her revelation after going through the grief intensive. that she had not even started this journey. And so she left the grief intensive with some decisions that she had to make to open up space in her calendar in order to find the time to really begin the journey. And that's okay. Sometimes I'm reluctant to have, people early in their grief coming to the grief intensive, because sometimes that's all you get of like, now it's time. Now, but at least you know how. Like, she'll be able to go into this next year of healing with those 3 clear ways in which she can process, right? What are those 3 ways? Separating the grief and trauma, identifying the trauma, processing and releasing it, and addressing the spiritual conflict. Last question came from someone who traumatically lost her husband to suicide 2 years prior. She had a very strong faith. Her husband had a very strong faith, and her husband had the faith of being Catholic. And there are some Catholics that believe that suicide is a sin. And she was really struggling with that. But her symptoms, she was like, I am frozen. I know what I need to do. I can't do it. And she knew very clearly that she had a spiritual conflict. And she knew very clearly that she had grief. But not once did she acknowledge and know that she had trauma. And so as she came to this grief intensive and we worked through separating that grief and trauma, the trauma began to be identified. She was able to see where those traumas were. We did some activities like brain spotting and sound bowls and Reiki, and she learned how to release some of that trauma. She left the grief intensive with a wholehearted, ready to make the decisions. She was no longer frozen. I hope that you will consider the grief intensive as part of your journey. But most importantly, I want you to feel comfortable in using my grief content as a way to identify these things. I actually have a playlist that is just me raw. I mean, it's raw footage after Maya passed away, before I started the 45 days of grief. If you want to watch that raw footage, if you are in that first year of grief and you want to be standing in some strength in a couple years, I want you to go and watch that and see how difficult it is. And I have authentically gone through this pain. We can do this.